When most people think of Scotland's long struggle for independence, they picture William Wallace raising his sword, the cry of freedom echoing across misty hills, or desperate battles fought against impossible odds. Yet the true turning point, the moment that shifted the destiny of an entire nation, came not with Wallace, but with another figure, Robert the Bruce. He was not only a warrior king, but also a survivor, a tactician, and a man who carried the hopes of his people in the darkest of times. Against all odds, he stood against one of the greatest armies in Europe, and through cunning and courage, changed the course of Scottish history forever. This is the story of Bannockburn, the battle that forged a legend and secured Scotland's independence. The year was 1314, and just outside the town of Stirling, on the rolling fields cut through by a small stream called the Bannockburn, two armies gathered. One army belonged to King Robert the Bruce of Scotland, a man hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, his hands scarred by ambushes, raids, and relentless campaigning. His vision was not one of conquest, but of independence, a Scotland free from English control. Facing him was Edward II of England, wielding the strength of a mighty kingdom and leading one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. The Scots were heavily outnumbered, perhaps 2-1, but they were not broken. They prepared not just to defend their land, but to decide once and for all whether their nation would live in chains or breathe freely. But the roots of this battle stretched back decades. Scotland at the end of the 13th century was a kingdom under pressure, pulled apart by both internal rivalries and external threats. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland died suddenly after falling from his horse. His only heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, but she was just a child, and she too died before she could ever claim the throne. Her death left the kingdom without a clear ruler, and the ensuing succession crisis plunged Scotland into chaos. Competing nobles, each with their own claim to the crown, turned desperately to Edward I of England to arbitrate. Edward was known as the Hammer of the Scots, a ruler as ambitious as he was ruthless. To him, Scotland was not a kingdom in need of help, but an opportunity. He supported John Balliol as king, but Balliol was reduced to little more than Edward's puppet, a king in name only while England treated Scotland as a vassal state. The humiliation of this arrangement sparked rebellion. In 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Murray led the first great uprising, rallying the Scots to victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. That triumph, however, was fleeting. A year later, Edward I struck back with overwhelming force, crushing Wallace at Falkirk. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and brought to London, where he was executed in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, hanged, drawn, and quartered. To the English crown, he was a traitor. To the Scots, he became a martyr. His death did not extinguish the flame of resistance, it only fanned it. Among those stirred by Wallace's defiance was Robert Bruce. A grandson of one of the original claimants to the throne, Bruce had ambition of his own. In 1306, he made his boldest move yet, killing his rival John Comyn inside a church. For that act, he was excommunicated by the Pope, branded an outlaw by England, and hunted like a criminal. At first, his cause looked doomed. Defeated in battle, forced into hiding, his followers scattered, Robert seemed destined for the same fate as Wallace. Yet unlike Wallace, he survived. Piece by piece, castle by castle, village by village, Bruce clawed back power. He burned fortresses that could not be held, denying them to the enemy. He avoided open battles he could not win, instead harassing English forces with ambushes, raids, and scorched earth tactics. Slowly, patiently, he rebuilt the fight for independence. By 1314, Bruce was no longer a desperate fugitive. He was a hardened commander with an army of veterans who trusted his every decision. Edward II, meanwhile, inherited his father's obsession with bringing Scotland to heel, but not his military brilliance. Where Edward I had been relentless, Edward II was indecisive and often swayed by his nobles. Yet when Stirling Castle came under siege by Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, the English king could not ignore it. The castle was one of the most important strongholds in Scotland. The garrison agreed to surrender unless relieved by midsummer of 1314. That ultimatum forced Edward II to act. He assembled a massive army, over 15,000 strong, filled with heavily armored knights, archers, and infantry. Robert the Bruce could muster perhaps 6,000 men, many of them ordinary farmers and townsmen called to defend their homeland. On paper, the contest seemed hopeless. The English host began its march north, a grinding advance that shook the countryside. Columns of men stretched for miles, steel glinting in the sun, banners snapping in the wind, and supply wagons groaning under the weight of provisions for siege and war. To local villagers, their passage was a nightmare, fields trampled, homes looted, food seized without mercy. Yet this was exactly what Robert had prepared for. He had stripped the land bare along Edward's path, ensuring that the further the English marched, the hungrier and more frustrated they became. Bruce, meanwhile, spent those weeks studying the terrain around Stirling. He chose the ground near the Bannockburn carefully. The land was narrow, marshy, and broken by woodland, perfect for neutralizing the English cavalry, the pride of their army. Heavy horses and armored knights would flounder in the boggy soil, while the stream itself created a natural obstacle. Bruce's strategy was simple but brilliant. Draw the English into this unfavorable ground, then stop them with schiltrons, tightly packed formations of spearmen forming walls of deadly points. By the time Edward II arrived, Bruce's forces were already positioned. They were fewer, but they were hardened by years of survival. They fought not for wages, but for their homes and freedom. The English were confident, even arrogant, convinced their numbers would crush the Scots quickly. But the Scots trusted their king. They believed in his plan, and as the summer of 1314 unfolded, the two armies edged closer to the inevitable confrontation. On the night of June 22nd, tension filled the air. In the Scottish camp, men sat around fires, sharpening spears, repairing armor, and whispering prayers. Priests moved among them, offering confessions and blessings. There was no panic, only resolve. Robert himself walked among his men, speaking to them as one of their own. He was no distant ruler. He was a king who had fought and bled beside them. His calm presence reassured them that the odds did not matter, because the ground itself favored their cause. Across the burn, the English camp sprawled across the fields like a sea of tents and banners. Knights drank and boasted loudly, certain of victory, while seasoned veterans muttered doubts. They remembered how resilient the Scots could be, and they knew the land was ill-suited to cavalry. Still, Edward II remained in his richly decorated pavilion, determined to stamp out the rebellion and claim glory. Then came a moment destined for legend. As dusk fell, Robert the Bruce rode out to survey the field. He wore only light armor, mounted not on a great war horse, but on a smaller palfrey. Suddenly, Sir Henry de Bohun, an English knight and nephew of the Earl of Hereford, spotted him. Seizing the chance to end the war with one stroke, Bohun spurred his massive warhorse forward, lowering his lance for the kill. The charge was fast and furious, the ground thundering beneath pounding hooves. Bohun's lance aimed directly for Bruce's chest. But the last instant, Robert swerved aside, rose in his stirrups, and brought his battle axe crashing down on Bohun's helmet. The weapon split the knight's skull in two, killing him instantly. So fierce was the blow that Bruce's axe shattered in his hands. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the Scottish ranks erupted in a roar of triumph. Their king had faced down an armored knight in single combat and won. Not just won, but done so with calm precision that electrified his men. To them, it was a sign. Robert the Bruce was not only their leader, he was the living embodiment of their fight for freedom. The spirit of Bannockburn had been set alight. As night descended upon the fields of Bannockburn, a heavy unease blanketed both armies. The Scottish soldiers looked to the death of Henry de Bohun as a sign from heaven itself. His fall beneath the axe of Robert the Bruce was not just a moment of triumph, but a symbol, a divine signal that perhaps God stood with them in the desperate struggle ahead. For the English, however, the loss was a humiliation. It reminded them with painful clarity that the enemy they faced was no ragged band of rebels to be swept aside, but men hardened by years of resistance, and led by a king who inspired loyalty through both courage and cunning. The camp settled into uneasy silence. Across the Scottish lines, torches flickered like restless stars, while priests moved quietly among the men, whispering blessings, prayers, and words of comfort. On the English side, nobles lifted cups of wine, toasting to a victory they assumed was inevitable. Horses shifted and snorted in the pickets, armor clattered softly as men checked straps and buckles, and the night became a long vigil. Everyone knew what dawn would bring: blood, chaos, and the judgment of history. When morning came on June 23rd, 1314, the fields of Bannockburn stirred to life. The cries of men, the stamping of restless horses, and the first glint of the sun across polished steel transformed anticipation into action. Robert the Bruce had chosen his ground with careful precision, and now his plan revealed itself. The Scots emerged from the cover of the woods and stood upon the open field in disciplined schiltrons, dense formations bristling with long spears and pikes that shone like a forest of iron. These were not the disorganized militias of old, but seasoned fighters who had endured years of guerrilla warfare. They marched forward not as prey to be hunted, but as a proud and defiant army ready to stand face to face against one of the mightiest kingdoms in Europe. The English King Edward II, confident in the weight of his vast army, unleashed the first blow. Columns of armored knights moved into position for a cavalry charge, their war horses pawing the earth impatiently as lances were lowered into place. The thunder of hooves soon rolled across the fields like a storm, dust rising in great clouds as the glittering tide of steel advanced with terrifying force. The sound of their battle cries pierced the air, echoing with confidence born of centuries of dominance. But the Scots stood firm. The front ranks leveled their pikes, planting their feet deep in the soil, waiting for the impact. Then came the collision. The earth trembled beneath the impact of thousands of pounds of horse and armored knight, smashing into an unyielding wall of spears. Horses reared, impaled upon the bristling forest of steel. Riders were flung from their saddles, crushed beneath the weight of their own mounts. The English charge, long believed unstoppable, broke upon the Scots like waves against a cliff. Panic spread through the cavalry as momentum faltered, and the charge dissolved into chaos. While the front clashed, another part of the English army attempted to cross the Bannockburn itself, hoping to outflank Bruce's carefully chosen position. But the ford was narrow, the ground treacherous, and the Scots knew every inch of it. As the English pressed forward, they found themselves trapped between the river and a wall of spears. Horses floundered in the shallow waters, men drowned in the crush, and bodies were swept downstream. The Scots counterattacked with ferocity, driving their enemies back, breaking the assault, and sending panic rippling through the English lines. By the close of the first day, the English were reeling. Their feared cavalry had been bloodied and broken, their attack repelled again and again. The marshy terrain denied them the space to deploy their archers or bring their massive numbers to bear. Edward II, inexperienced and indecisive, seemed unable to adapt to the conditions. His army grew restless, their confidence shaken. Across the field, the Scots celebrated not just survival, but triumph. They had not merely endured England's fury, they had stood unbroken. And in doing so, they had proven that Bruce's leadership and their discipline could withstand the storm. That night, as the English sat by their fires in frustration, the Scots withdrew in good order, their spirits soaring. The battlefield lay littered with broken lances, shattered shields, and the fallen, but it was the English morale that suffered the deepest wound. And so dawn rose on June 24th, the day that would decide everything. Edward II commanded one of the largest armies ever brought into Scotland, yet unease rippled through his ranks. Across the burn, Bruce's smaller force waited in silence, their spears gleaming under the morning light. Before the clash began, Bruce gathered his men in prayer. Clerics and friars, dressed in simple robes, moved through the formations, blessing each soldier. Hymns filled the air as the men knelt on the grass, their spears planted upright around them like a forest of faith and steel. To the English who watched, the sight appeared almost laughable. They kneeled to beg for mercy, some scoffed. But they were wrong. The Scots were not pleading. They were steeling themselves, calling upon God not for deliverance, but to bear witness to their struggle for freedom. When the hymns ended, the Scots rose as one, their schiltrons tightening into impregnable walls. Their faces were grim, their resolve unshaken. Edward II, angered by the humiliations of the previous day, ordered his full army to advance. His commanders warned him once more of the marshy ground and the narrow approaches that hindered their cavalry, but the king would not listen. He wanted Bruce crushed, his rebellion ended, and his crown secured through overwhelming force. The English host surged forward in waves, thousands of men marching as one, the ground trembling beneath their weight. To any observer, the sheer scale of Edward's army seemed enough to smother the Scots completely. Yet Robert the Bruce had calculated every detail of this battlefield. Every marsh, every ford, every ridge had been chosen for a reason. And as the English pressed forward, he waited with a confidence born not of numbers, but of strategy, faith, and a cause no army could easily extinguish. As the English knights thundered forward once again, the Scottish schiltrons advanced to meet them head-on. This time, Robert the Bruce had given an order that changed everything. On the previous day, his men had been told to hold their ground. Now, they were told not merely to stand, but to push into the enemy. What followed was one of the most dramatic sights of medieval warfare. Dense blocks of spearmen, tight formations bristling like living hedgehogs, moved steadily across the field. Every step forward pressed a wall of sharpened pikes into the path of the English knights. Horses, normally the unstoppable engine of chivalric warfare, shrieked and balked in terror at the advancing spears, throwing their armored riders helplessly into the mud. Those knights who dared to charge recklessly were impaled, crushed beneath the crush of men, or pulled down by Scottish infantry and dispatched on the ground. The English longbowmen, feared across Europe and decisive in countless battles, could not even bring their bows to bear. Trapped behind their own cavalry and pressed tightly by the Scottish advance, they had no clear line of fire. Their great weapon, the bow, became useless in the chaos. The very size of Edward's massive host was now turning against itself. On the narrow battlefield, the English had little room to maneuver. Packed shoulder to shoulder, men-at-arms, knights, and horses were pressed together so tightly that retreat was nearly impossible. The Scots continued their relentless march, spear meeting shield, pike pushing through armor. Panic began to ripple through the English ranks as formations started to crumble beneath the unyielding Scottish assault. Then, as if the pressure alone were not enough, came the moment that broke English morale entirely. From the hills surrounding the battlefield, a wave of camp followers, cooks, grooms, servants, and others who had trailed with the Scottish army charged down into the fray. They were armed with little more than makeshift weapons, farm tools, and banners. But to the exhausted English, it looked like fresh reinforcements pouring into the fight. What had already been fear turned instantly into full-scale panic. Knights abandoned their formations and trampled their own infantry in their desperate attempt to escape. Men rushed toward the Bannockburn, the stream that cut through the battlefield, but the waterway became a death trap. Horses and men alike drowned in its rushing waters as they tried to cross in blind terror. Even King Edward II himself was nearly captured in the collapse. He was forced to flee with only a small retinue for protection, his once mighty host disintegrating behind him. Riding north, he sought refuge at Stirling Castle, the very stronghold that had drawn both armies to this battlefield. But the castle's governor, Sir Philip de Mowbray, refused him entry, knowing the fortress was already doomed to surrender. Humiliated, the king pressed on, barely escaping with his life as he made his way to Dunbar, and from there, back to England in disgrace. The mighty English army, once tens of thousands strong, had shattered in a single day. When the fighting ended, the field belonged to the Scots. All around, the ground was littered with the dead and dying. Thousands of English knights and soldiers lay broken. Others had been captured and would later be ransomed for enormous sums, bringing a wave of wealth into Scotland. The Scots seized immense spoils, horses, arms, armor, and provisions enough to sustain their forces for months. Yet the greatest treasure of all was not material wealth. It was the knowledge that Scotland, against every conceivable odd, had stood its ground and triumphed. Robert the Bruce had not merely won a battle. He had secured a nation's freedom. The consequences of Bannockburn reached far beyond the blood-soaked fields of June 1314. Entire households of English nobility had been wiped out. Families that had sent sons, fathers, and brothers to fight in Edward's campaign were left devastated. For England, it was a disaster. For Edward II, it was a personal humiliation. Where his father, Edward I, had been remembered as the hammer of the Scots, Edward II would forever be mocked as the king who had fled from them. His authority, already fragile at home, crumbled further in the aftermath. His barons, already restless with his rule, grew even more rebellious, emboldened by his failures in Scotland. For Robert the Bruce, however, Bannockburn was more than just vindication. Years earlier, his legitimacy had been questioned after his bloody seizure of the throne. Many had doubted whether he could unite the fractured Scottish nobility or withstand the might of England. But after Bannockburn, all doubts vanished. His victory was complete, his crown secure. The Chiltern formations had also changed the very face of warfare. They had proven that disciplined infantry, ordinary men armed with long spears, could shatter the dominance of heavy cavalry, the most feared military force of the medieval world. This lesson would echo across Europe, altering the strategies of kings and generals for generations to come. But Bannockburn was not only a military triumph. It was a cultural and psychological one. Men who had once wavered in their loyalties, uncertain whether to side with England or Bruce, now rallied behind their king. The battle gave them more than hope, it gave them belief. The victory inspired songs, legends, and stories that carried across villages and towns. In time, poets would immortalize the moment. Centuries later, Robert Burns himself would write verses that imagined Bruce's words to his men on the eve of the battle, transforming history into enduring myth. The impact of Bannockburn was felt not only in Britain but across Europe. News of the Scottish victory reached France and the papal court. No longer was Scotland dismissed as a rebellious province. It was seen as a kingdom in its own right, capable of defeating one of the most powerful monarchies in Christendom. Though full recognition would take years, Bannockburn laid the foundation for Scottish sovereignty on the international stage. In the decades and centuries that followed, Bannockburn became legend. Robert the Bruce was remembered not only as a king, but as a warrior who embodied the soul of his people. The very landscape where the battle was fought grew sacred in the Scottish imagination. Every brook, hill, and field seemed a whisper of freedom defended with blood and steel. The memory of June 1314 became a rallying cry in times of war, in political struggles, and even in moments of cultural revival. Ultimately, the greatest legacy of Bannockburn was not the spoils, not the land, not even the immediate military victory. It was the spirit it gave to Scotland. It was proof that a small nation, united by determination and courage, could defy even the greatest empire. For Robert the Bruce, it was vindication. For his people, it was liberation. For the world, it was a reminder that history is not written only by the mighty, but by those who refuse to yield. Bannockburn was more than a battle. It was the making of a nation.